All right, welcome back everybody to the deep dive. We've got a fascinating one today, and it's really crucial for anyone working in pharmaceuticals, biotech, or medical devices. We're diving deep into data integrity.
Yeah, data integrity.
You are amazing listeners.
Hmm.
Sent in a ton of great resources about the FDA and how they're, getting really serious about this whole data integrity thing. So what we're going to do is break it all down for you. We're going to pull out the most important stuff so you can really grasp why this matters so much.
Absolutely. And I think it's easy to get lost in the details, when it comes to data integrity. But what we really want to get across is the big picture. How does it affect patients? How does it affect the credibility of these entire industries? And the stuff you send in makes it crystal clear. The FDA is not messing around anymore. This is front and center for them.
No, definitely not. I mean, we're seeing the evidence.
Mhm.
Way more FDA warning letters going out and the reasons behind them. Well, they're pretty serious stuff, like deleting data or even worse, falsifying data, not to mention messing with records without permission.
Mhm.
And then there are the problems with the electronic systems that are supposed to be protecting all this information in the first place.
Right. And it's not just about someone, deliberately doing something wrong. It's about those systems and processes. They have to be rock solid. You can't just hope for the best. And you're right. These aren't just minor slip-ups. They can have huge consequences for these companies. I mean, it can really damage their reputation and even lead to, well, legal issues. But at the end of the day, it all comes back to patient safety.
Exactly. That's the core of it all.
Hmm.
If the data is messed up, if it's not accurate, then how can we trust the medicines and devices that are developed from it? It's just not possible. So let's get into some of the details from what you said. What's been happening lately with FDA regulations? It seems like they've been making some big moves.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And it's interesting to see how their approach is evolving. The FDA came out with updated guidance on data integrity, specifically for those bioavailability and bioequivalence studies. Those are super important, especially for generic drug approvals. But this is a big deal because it shows that the FDA is really expanding its focus on data integrity.
Right, so it's not just about these specific studies.
Exactly. They want to see solid data integrity practices throughout the entire process, like from the very first research phases all the way through manufacturing and even after the product is on the market. So it's not just about keeping those lab notebooks tidy. It's about building this whole, what they call data lifecycle, that is totally reliable and trustworthy.
So a much bigger, broader expectation.
Absolutely. And the increase in enforcement actions really drives that point home. Like, we're seeing more warning letters that specifically call out data deletion or falsification. That's a huge red flag, obviously. But they're also going after, stuff that might seem less intentional, but is still a big deal, like unauthorized changes to data and weaknesses in how electronic systems are controlled. So it's not just about catching the bad guys, it's about making sure the entire system is strong and secure.
And it's not just the FDA either, right? It seems like agencies all over the world are jumping on board with this.
Yeah, totally. Like the EMA in Europe and the MHRA in the UK, they're all getting tougher on data integrity. So this is a global trend for sure. And, when you think about it, it makes sense. Data integrity is a fundamental part of public health, and that's a global issue.
Okay, so we're talking about a worldwide push for better data practices. Now, speaking of the global scene, with all the technology we have today, the FDA's focus on 21 CFR Part 11 seems, well, very timely. For anyone who might not be familiar with all the regulatory jargon, could you give us a breakdown of why this is so important, especially with all the new digital tools out there?
Sure, sure. Think of 21 CFR Part 11 as the FDA's rule book for making sure those electronic records and signatures are as trustworthy and legit as good old-fashioned paper ones. And with all these digital tools like cloud platforms, mobile devices, and AI in clinical trials, the FDA wants to be absolutely certain that these systems are secure. So what they're looking for are things like really strong audit trails, which is like a detailed history of who did what to the data and when.
Oh, so it's kind of like a detective's log?
Yeah, exactly. You can see who accessed what, who made changes, and the exact time it all happened. And of course, there have to be strong security measures to prevent people from messing with the data, you know, hacking or tampering. And then there's the whole validation process. That's all about making sure these systems are actually working correctly, the way they're supposed to.
So even if a company is using the latest and greatest technology, they can't just assume that their data is automatically good to go.
Right. They have to be proactive about building these controls into their systems from the very beginning. And believe me, the FDA is paying close attention to this stuff during inspections. If you're not doing it right, they'll find out.
Okay, so we've talked about what the FDA is looking for, but what are some of the challenges that companies are running into when it comes to data integrity. The stuff you sent in highlighted some pretty common problems.
Yeah, and one of the big ones, and it might sound kind of basic, is that companies often don't have clear procedures in place. They might not even have all the records they should. And, this might seem like a small thing, but it comes up again and again in those FDA warning letters.
So it's not just about having the data, it's about having a system for managing it.
Absolutely. And often the biggest data integrity failures happen because there are no clear, step-by-step instructions for how to handle data from start to finish. These are called standard operating procedures or
Okay.
SOPs. And without them, it's just chaos. People are doing things differently. Documentation is incomplete or wrong, and important records just go missing. And as we'll see in those case studies later, if the FDA sees a pattern of this kind of stuff, well, they're not going to be happy.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like trying to build a house without a blueprint. Another challenge you highlighted was not doing enough audit trail reviews. Why are those reviews so important for data integrity?
Think of it this way. Those electronic systems keep these super detailed logs, like a timeline of every single thing that's done with the data. Who looked at it? Who made changes? When did it all happen? That's the audit trail. But just having those logs isn't enough. You have to actually look at them.
Ah, so it's not enough to just record everything.
Nope. You have to analyze it, see if anything looks fishy. If you don't review the audit trails carefully, then you might miss things like unauthorized changes, errors, or even deliberate fraud. It could go on for a long time before anyone notices.
So it's like having a security camera but never bothering to check the footage. And what about user access controls? It seems like some organizations aren't being as strict as they should be about who can access sensitive data.
Yeah, that's a big one. It's really risky to have shared logins. If multiple people are using the same username and password, then you have absolutely no idea who's actually doing what. It's impossible to track individual actions. And then there's the issue of giving people more access than they really need. That's called excessive privileges, and it's just asking for trouble.
Right, so even if it's not intentional, someone could make a mistake and change or delete data that they shouldn't be messing with.
Exactly. And then how can you tell the FDA, yep, our data is totally accurate, if you don't even know who has access to it and what they're doing? It's a recipe for disaster.
Okay, so those are some pretty common pitfalls. The sources you sent also mentioned the risk of using outdated or unvalidated systems, like old software or even spreadsheets that haven't been properly checked.
Oh, yeah. That's a big no-no in these industries, especially when it comes to good manufacturing practices or GMP. You can't just assume that any computer system is going to work perfectly and do what it's supposed to do. That's where validation comes in.
So validation is like a way of proving that the system is reliable.
Exactly. It's a very detailed process where you basically show, with documentation, that the system does what it's supposed to do and that it meets all the required standards. And this is super important because if you're using a system that hasn't been validated, the data it produces might not be accurate. And, the FDA really cracks down on this. Plus, if you're using old software, there could be security holes or it might not work with newer systems. So validation and keeping things up to date are essential.
Right. It's not a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the whole issue of data backup and retention. It's not just about having the data readily available right now, but also making sure it's safe and accessible in the future.
Yeah, data integrity isn't just about today, it's about tomorrow too. What happens if your system crashes? What if there's a fire or a natural disaster? You need to have backups, and you need to know that you can actually recover that data when you need it. And keep in mind, those regulatory agencies have very specific rules about how long you need to keep raw data. If you don't follow those rules, you could have some serious problems during an inspection.
Okay, so those are some of the big challenges that companies are facing. Now let's shift gears and talk about solutions. What are some best practices that organizations can put in place to really strengthen their data integrity game?
Well, the first thing, and this is really the foundation of everything else, is to create a culture where data integrity is a top priority. I mean, it has to be woven into the very fabric of the company.
So it's more than just a bunch of rules in a handbook.
Exactly. It has to be part of the company's DNA. Everyone, from the top executives down to the folks on the front lines, needs to understand that accurate and reliable data is absolutely essential. And they need to feel comfortable speaking up if they see something that might be a problem.
That makes sense. It's about building a culture of trust and accountability. And to make that happen, it seems like you need those clear procedures and a solid governance framework, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Those SOPs we talked about, those are crucial. Every single step of the data lifecycle needs to be spelled out. No room for ambiguity. From the moment the data is collected to how it's processed, analyzed, stored, and eventually archived. And then on top of those procedures, you need a robust data governance framework. That's basically the structure that provides oversight and makes sure everyone's following the rules. And don't forget about internal audits. Those are key for catching any weaknesses in those procedures or any deviations from them.
So it's not just about setting the rules, it's about making sure people are following them, and then checking to make sure the rules are actually working.
You got it. It's a constant cycle of improvement. Now, let's talk about the technical side of things. How can companies beef up their user access controls?
Yeah, we've talked about the problems with shared logins and excessive privileges. How do you fix that?
Well, the first thing is to make sure everyone has their own unique login. No more sharing passwords. That way you can track exactly who's doing what. And then you need to make sure people only have access to the data they absolutely need for their jobs. We call that the principle of least privilege. One way to manage that is through role-based permissions. So instead of giving access based on individual requests, you assign permissions based on the person's role in the company.
So it's all about making sure people only have access to what's relevant to their work.
Exactly. And if you want to go even further, you can use multi-factor authentication. That's where you need more than just a password to log in. It might be a code from your phone or a fingerprint scan. It adds an extra layer of security to make it much harder for unauthorized people to get in.
Right. It's like having multiple locks on your door. Makes sense. And we can't forget about validation. How do companies make sure their systems are validated and stay that way?
So, any computer system that's handling important regulatory data needs to be validated. That means lab instruments, manufacturing software, cloud platforms, the whole nine yards. And it's not enough to just validate it once and call it a day. Systems need to be revalidated regularly, and they need to be maintained properly. That means keeping software up to date, installing security patches, and just generally making sure things are running smoothly.
It's like a car. You got to take it in for regular tune-ups and maintenance. And of course, there's data backup, which we talked about before. How do you set up a robust backup system?
This is crucial. You need to have a system for regularly backing up your data, and it has to be secure. And here's the really important part. You need to actually test your backups. You need to make sure that if you ever have to restore your data, it will actually work. Don't wait until there's a disaster to find out your backups are corrupted or inaccessible. And as we discussed before, this applies to both electronic data and those paper records.
Makes sense. And finally, what about training and monitoring? It seems like those are key for keeping everyone on the same page and catching potential problems early on.
Absolutely. You need to have ongoing training programs to make sure everyone understands data integrity and how to follow the rules. That means going over those SOPs, teaching people how to review audit trails, and making sure they know how to use those electronic systems correctly. And you need to be monitoring everything. Regularly check those audit logs, do periodic compliance checks. That way you can catch any potential issues before they blow up into big problems.
So it's all about staying vigilant and proactive. The sources you sent also included some really interesting case studies, real-world examples of what can happen when things go wrong. Let's take a look at those. The first one was about a company that got in trouble for problems with their manufacturing records. What happened there?
Oh, this one is a classic example of what not to do. This pharmaceutical company had already been warned by the FDA about similar problems during an earlier inspection. But they didn't fix the problems. They didn't take it seriously enough. So, what happened? The FDA came back and slapped them with a formal warning letter, and they had to come up with a very detailed plan to fix everything, which included a complete investigation of all the data that might be inaccurate, risk assessments to figure out the potential impact, and way more oversight of their manufacturing processes. The lesson here is that the FDA expects you to learn from your mistakes. If you don't fix those data integrity problems, you're going to have a bad time.
So procrastination doesn't pay off when it comes to data integrity.
Not at all. And then there was that other case study, the one about electronic data problems in clinical trials. What was the issue there?
Oh, this one was really interesting. The company had set up a system for capturing data electronically, but it didn't have a proper audit trail. So when the FDA came knocking, they couldn't verify whether any of the data had been changed after it was entered.
Yeah, without that audit trail, it's impossible to know for sure if the data is accurate. And the consequences were pretty serious. The sponsor of the clinical trial had to withdraw their application to the FDA.
Wow, that's a big deal. It really shows how critical data integrity is for getting new medicines and devices approved. So as we wrap things up, what's the main takeaway for our listeners?
Here's the thing. Ensuring data integrity isn't a one-and-done task. It's an ongoing commitment. It's about being constantly vigilant, having those solid procedures in place, and never letting your guard down. And the FDA is getting more sophisticated all the time. They're using data analytics and all sorts of tools to find problems. So companies really need to step up their game.
And it's not just about avoiding those penalties from the FDA. It's about doing the right thing for patients. It's about making sure those medicines and devices are safe and effective.
Exactly. It's about trust. If the data is not reliable, then the whole system breaks down. And that's why this is so important.
So to our listeners, remember that keeping your data clean and reliable isn't just about checking boxes for the FDA. It's about protecting patients and upholding the integrity of these entire industries. And as we've seen, the FDA is definitely watching, and they're not afraid to take action.
And that brings us to a really important question for you to think about. Given all these challenges and how much emphasis is being put on data integrity, what can you do? What can your organization do to not only meet those regulations, but to really build a system that is rock solid? How can you make sure your data is trustworthy both now and in the future?
That's a great question to leave everyone with. Thanks so much for joining us for another deep dive. Until next time.